Welcome to the History of Spain podcast. My name is Joe and I'm the host of the History of the Netherlands podcast. We are loving David's history of Spain and his swarthy Spanish accent, and we're sure that you are too. Spain has a great history, particularly in our heretical eyes, because at some point it's going to come crashing into our favorite topic, the history of the Netherlands, in a little thing called the Guerra de los 80 Años in Spanish, but more romantically, of course, in Dutch as the 80-jarige oorlog, the 80 Years' War, in which a Dutch revolt against Spanish occupation divided the lowlands into the 7 united provinces of the Netherlands and a Dutch/French-speaking area known as the Spanish Netherlands, as if Belgium wasn't confusing enough already. Anyway, we are now recruiting rebellious listeners to the Dutch side of this cause. We release new episodes every 2 weeks and explore how a boggy marshland became a vibrant mercantile society, a sea-trotting global superpower, and a centre for modern-day liberalism. And also how the Spanish eventually took their 400-year-old revenge for the 80 Years' War by beating the Netherlands in the World Cup final in 2010. It still hurts. You can find the show at all the usual podcast outlets. Just search for History of the Netherlands. Enjoy this episode of the History of Spain podcast.
I'm David Cott, host of the History of Spain podcast, and this is episode 18 called Tyranny and Peace. In this episode, you will learn about the tyrannical reign of the old Chindasuinth, the peaceful reign of his son Requeswinth, some aspects of the powerful Spanish Church, and the legacy of the Visigoths in Spain. Subscribe to the podcast to not miss an episode. In the last episode titled Changing Dynasties, I talk about the rebellion of Chindasuinth that led to the overthrow of King Tulga. And in the verdict, I already mentioned that Chindasuinth took bold measures to limit aristocratic and ecclesiastical power. Without a doubt, the reigns of Leovigild and Chindasuinth defined the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo. Those kings represented the ideal of a centralized and Caesaro-Papist state of the late antiquity. However, that brings up the question of why that ideal was challenged over and over again. The paradox is that the political structure of the Visigothic kingdom was sustained by a landowner class of large estates. Those landowners formed noble factions through relationships of dependency and fidelity that were constantly fighting to achieve the hegemony that royal power represented. It's quite easy to see the contradiction of having a quasi-feudal society while attempting to establish a strong and centralized state. In the long run, if there were no changes in the economic and social relationships, failure was granted for such an attempt to consolidate royal power. Chindasuinth ascended the throne being 79 years old, and he had a turbulent past of participating in several failed conspiracies. Needless to say, he understood the internal problems of the Visigothic kingdom, and he knew how noble factions and conspiracies were formed. I mean, that's precisely what he did to usurp the throne. Chindasuinth exploited the structural political weaknesses of the realm to conquer royal power, but as he was now king, he had to fix those weaknesses to prevent rebellions against his rule. Therefore, Chindasuinth followed 4 steps for dummies to achieve his aims. The first step was the execution and forced exile of hundreds of nobles and the confiscation of their properties. Second, Chindasuinth closed ties with the noble faction that supported him in exchange of several concessions and privileges. The third step consisted in enriching himself and his family with new estates. And the fourth and last step was about fusing even more secular and religious power. Let's go more into detail with each step. Chindaswinth executed 200 first-rank nobles and 500 of lesser standing, while many more went into exile in Frankish or Basque territory, either to avoid being sentenced to death or charged for conspiring against the king. The confiscation of properties was the norm against those executed or exiled. Actually, not only their properties, but their widows and daughters were redistributed amongst the king's supporters. It was certainly a major redistribution of political power and wealth, and even though it was a tyrannical and very harsh act, it produced a period of stability. Later on, Chindaswinth summoned the bishops of the kingdom in the 7th Council of Toledo in 646, where the law against treason added excommunication on those who conspired against the king, and it extended the punishment to the clergy too. The bishops for sure feared Chindaswinth. Most of those labeled as traitors faced execution, but they could accept royal benevolence and be blinded instead. Chindaswinth sure was a nice guy. As for the second step of creating a loyal noble faction, it's something rather simple and common in world history. Making your supporters wealthier or moving them up in terms of social status. Chindaswinth forced the marriage of the widows and daughters of those who were executed or exiled with his supporters, to restructure the alliances and kinship ties. More interestingly, he gave certain rights to royal slaves that occupied important positions in the administration of the state, such as giving them the right to testify, mainly to use them against their former masters. A truly clever policy once again. The third step was about amassing estates for the royal family, something essential to make his position more secure. It wasn't difficult to own more estates, since he just made some of those estates he had confiscated his own. And the fourth step, that consisted in increasing his power over religious affairs, was materialized by making the word of a king equal to that of God. Disobedience was therefore sacrilege. And he managed to do that without increasing anti-Jewish policies. What an achievement! To control more firmly the nobility and clergy on a provincial level, the king played them against each other. He allowed bishops to inspect the judicial sentences of the secular administration, which allowed him to control more closely the clergy as he used them as royal administrators. Even though Chindaswinth was a great benefactor of the church, he had many enemies in the clergy. It's not surprising, since they didn't like the interference of royal power in ecclesiastical affairs, nor how Chindaswinth removed some of their privileges. Nonetheless, he had collaborators. For instance, the prominent bishop of Zaragoza, Braulio of Zaragoza. Braulio of Zaragoza, along other bishops, advised Chindaswinth to associate Requeswinth to the Visigothic throne. There are some possible explanations. Maybe their supporters feared that the old Chindaswinth could die soon, and with him everything they had obtained in exchange of their loyalty. Another explanation could be that there was an increasing opposition within the nobility and clergy, and Chindaswinth's supporters needed to ensure the continuity of the regime, to again preserve their wealth. In the end, it's all about money and power. Anyway, Requeswinth was made co-ruler in 649, and Requeswinth started his sole reign when his father died in 653. Before he died, Chindaswinth commissioned a new codification of laws for the kingdom. In 654, the codification was finished, and Requeswinth promulgated what became known as the Visigothic Code. In episode 15, titled Leovigild, Restorer and Unifier, I mentioned that King Leovigild not only essentially unified Hispania under Visigothic rule, he attempted to unify religiously and legally the Hispano-Roman and Gothic population. Apparently, the lost code of Leovigild eliminated most legal differences between Goths and natives, but not all. On the contrary, the Visigothic code of Requeswinth was applied equally to both groups that at this point presented no differences. The subjects of the kingdom stopped being Roman or Gothic, instead they became Spanish. The Visigothic code combined elements of Roman, Catholic, and Germanic customary laws, and it included laws that dealt with legal procedures, crimes, marriage and divorce, succession, financial transactions, and Jews. It was the most important legal code of the Visigothic kingdom, as it outlived the kingdom and it was still used by the Mozara population, that is, by the Christians under Muslim rule, until the 13th century. King Ferdinand III adopted the Visigothic code almost entirely to apply it in certain towns, and it was used in parts of Spain as late as in the 19th century. Going back to the dynastic succession, it wasn't unquestioned. A Gothic political refugee named Froya made an alliance with the Vascones of Aquitaine and other Gothic refugees to support him. The rebels devastated much of Tarraconensis, but they were unable to capture Zaragoza. Froya and his forces decided to go all in instead of retreating to Aquitaine to regain strength. But in the end, royal power won, many of the Gothic refugees and Vascones perished in the battlefield, and Froya was executed. Requeswinth suppressed the rebellion quick enough, but he needed to close ranks and his supporters for sure asked for rewards. That may explain why Requeswinth carried out a conciliatory policy with the nobility and clergy, as opposed to the tyrannical policies of his father. The aristocratic requests were recognized in the 8th Council of Toledo, a council with a very high attendance rate and the first to see the participation of royal officials. The king's supporters agreed to allow Requeswinth the choice of pardoning those who were persecuted by Chindaswinth, although they didn't allow a complete pardon. There were other measures to somehow facilitate the return of the political refugees, and that's essentially in what consisted the conciliatory policy of Requeswinth, protecting the interests of his loyal supporters while reconciling with those who suffered the confiscations and executions of his father. Neither his enemies nor his supporters liked how Chindaswinth had treated confiscated property as his own. Therefore, his son was forced to accept to clearly differentiate the property of the royal family and the property of the crown. That certainly made sense in an elective monarchy, and it sure limited any pretensions of establishing a long-lasting hereditary monarchy. It's obvious that those nobles who backed Chindaswinth in his coup and who supported the succession of Requeswinth felt that the old king had kept too many estates for himself rather than for the crown or his supporters. These nobles didn't have the guts to protest when Chindaswinth was alive, but instead had waited cautiously until they saw the opportunity to exploit the weakness of Requeswinth's position. Another decision taken at the council was referred to the succession of the king. They decided that the election of a new king had to take place in the royal palace, and that the electors would be the bishops and nobles of the court. In practice, that meant that only the Bishop of Toledo and the nobles of the inner circle of the previous king had the power to elect a new king. It was a way to ensure not the continuity of the ruling dynasty, but the continuity of the ruling noble faction. We basically have no information about the remaining years of Requeswinth, even though he reigned alone for 19 years, from 653 to 672. It's very likely that he had to send several expeditions to keep the northern peoples in check, and it seems like there were changes in socioeconomic terms that further weakened central power. The administrative reforms of Chindaswinth may have accelerated the process because many civil positions disappeared and were assumed by military officers. Chindaswinth may have thought that simplifying the administration and concentrating power in a few hands would help him in controlling the nobility that supported him. But in the long run, the opposite may be the case. Territorial decentralization weakened political unity, in a moment where most of the peasantry didn't consider the protection of their lords worth the price. The society of the Visigothic kingdom was very polarized in the late 7th century, because the landowner elite of large estates was only worried about increasing their wealth and gaining more social connections, while the peasantry lived in very poor conditions. Will you happily fight and pay taxes for someone that gave you essentially nothing in return? For sure not. Many colonus, who were almost enslaved peasants, ran away from the lands they were associated to, and it seems like the colonus had kind of a class consciousness, because many helped those fugitive colonus. And what was the genius response of the Visigothic elite? Toughening laws against those fugitives and those who took them in. The peasantry only hated their lords more and more. Like before the fall of the Roman Empire, brigandage plagued the roads of the late Visigothic kingdom, which is an indication that at the death of King Requeswinth, the realm was suffering from great insecurity and social and political instability. This internal division and weak social unity was very effectively exploited later by the Muslim invaders, as we will see in a few episodes. On the other hand, the Visigothic kingdom didn't have to worry much about external enemies during most of the 7th century. The Frankish lords were constantly fighting each other. The Franks aided some Visigothic usurpers and rebels, but the Franks weren't the existential threat that they used to be in the early 6th century. The other old enemy, the Eastern Roman Empire, went from crisis after crisis during the 7th century. The Romans first fought the Persians, then the Arabs of the Caliphate, while also having to deal with the Slavs that were settling in the Balkans, as well as social and religious internal divisions. However, the Visigothic kingdom remained very vulnerable to external aggression, because the political and social structure of the realm was inherently weak. Kings feared that groups within the realm could conspire with foreign powers. That's why there were both civil and ecclesiastical laws that imposed penalties on those who dared to do so. To talk a bit about the organization of the Spanish Church, the essential thing to know is that it was divided in 6 dioceses, following the late Roman division of provinces: Tarraconensis, Carthaginensis, Baetica, Lusitania, Galicia, and Narbonensis. As the Visigoths conquered Hispania and established the capital in Toledo, Toledo was made the metropolitan capital of Carthaginensis, and the Bishop of Toledo was superior to the rest. The close link between ecclesiastical and secular power is what made that happen, not without some opposition within the church. Royal power and the Bishop of Toledo sometimes intervene in the election of provincial bishops, but most of the time the provincial clergy elected their bishop themselves. Bishops had the duty to monitor the local clergy, to prevent spiritual corruption and the spread of wrong beliefs. But in the Visigothic kingdom, after the conversion of Recoret to Catholicism, bishops heavily intervened in the secular administration of the kingdom. Bishops were judges of ecclesiastical conflicts, but they also judge acts that transgress certain civil laws or both ecclesiastical and civil laws. Again, this brings up the question of what kind of a state the Visigothic kingdom was. But as I said in previous episodes, it was not a theocracy. It was a state where secular and religious power help and watch each other. For instance, secular authorities could judge some strictly religious offenses and fine the offenders, a fine that went to the pockets of secular authorities. So what you need to understand is that the church and the administration cooperated in a way that was beneficial for both parties. The clearest example of that cooperation was the Councils of Toledo, where civil and ecclesiastical authorities discussed the most important political and religious issues. Nonetheless, there were some limitations to the role of judge of bishops in civil offenses, as for instance, they couldn't sentence someone to death. Now I want to talk about the role of monasteries in this period. Ever since the reign of Leovigild, monasteries had expanded in the Iberian Peninsula, thanks to the will of many African, Greek, and Spanish clergymen. Monks and hermits lived an ascetic life and sought their own spiritual salvation in isolated areas, living alone or in group. Due to their establishment in isolated areas, they spread Christianity in communities that were still pagan, for instance certain areas of Asturias and Cantabria, or in the northwestern Pyrenees where the Vascones live. We know the name of some of those Christian proselytizers, such as Emilian or Valerius of Prieto. A very prolific founder of monasteries was Fructuosus of Braga, a Gothic hermit and bishop who founded no less than 20 monasteries throughout Galicia, Lusitania, and Baetica. But we don't know the name of many other monks and monastic founders that ensured the Christianization of the most marginal areas of the Iberian Peninsula. The Christianization of those mountainous regions will eventually transform them from the most backward parts of the peninsula into bastions of resistance to Islam and birthplaces of new Christian kingdoms. Regarding the relationship of the Spanish Church with Rome and other foreign churches, the Spanish Church recognized the supremacy of the Pope and made efforts to align their doctrines and decisions in line with what was decided in universal councils. Despite that, it's obvious that the Spanish Church wasn't as close to other churches as it used to be during the Roman period. This is kind of logical, because the Western Roman Empire disintegrated into several kingdoms that were developing a kind of national or unitary consciousness. But to be more specific, a major reason is that the Eastern Roman Empire controlled Rome. As the Spanish Church became closely linked to the Visigothic monarchy, relationships with Rome became more complicated because the two states were foes. Another reason is that the Spanish Catholic Church gained strength after the conversion of the Visigoths, so it could deal with their own problems without the assistance of other churches. That doesn't mean that the Spanish Church was an independent church opposed to Rome, as some historians say. On the contrary, it means that the Spanish Church was strongly organized, so they just needed to consult a few times Rome to solve some issues. Lastly, I want to talk about the legacy of the Visigoths. Their contributions have often been ignored or even seen in a negative light. They left few artistic works, no substantial unique architecture, and little linguistic legacy. However, the Visigoths did leave an important legacy. As I explained in the previous episode, Muslim Spain has often been regarded as the reversers of the cultural and scientific decadence that the Visigoths brought. That's far from being true, because under the Visigoths, Spain produced great intellectual works, such as those of Saint Isidore of Seville, and the Spanish clergy preserved classical works that would have been lost otherwise. They also preserved the Roman bathing culture, just as the Muslims did later. The Visigoths also made the free Hispano-Roman and Gothic population equal in law, and under them the Spanish clergy unified the liturgy of the kingdom in what became known as the Hispanic or Mozarabic rite that Christians preserve in Muslim-ruled territories. More importantly, the Visigoths unified Spain politically and religiously. The idea of Spain as a distinct entity emerged then, defined by the boundaries of the Iberian Peninsula. And that political unification is exactly what the Christian medieval kings pursued during the so-called Reconquista. With the conversion of the Visigoths to Catholicism, the Visigoths and Hispano-Romans shared the same religion, something that had a profound impact on the history of Spain and all Spanish countries. For instance, it meant a long relationship of close collaboration between the church and the state, or the persecution, forced conversion, or expulsion of Jews for the sake of religious unity. It was the memory of the Visigothic kingdom as an independent Spanish and Catholic kingdom that was used to justify ideologically the Reconquista. The verdict! In today's verdict, I want to discuss why it was impossible to establish a strong and long-lasting royal dynasty, which is kind of a continuation of the verdict of the previous episode. The efforts of Chindaswinth to end forever the endless internal struggles between noble factions failed, even though he had executed many important nobles. Chindaswinth ruled using fear, and no one dared to oppose him when he was alive. But as Tyrion told Daenerys in Season 7 of Game of Thrones, fear is all Chindaswinth had. That made his position brittle, because many beneath him wanted to see him dead. Even his faction of loyal supporters didn't approve his disproportionate confiscations to enrich himself and his family. So, once the tyrant died, a rebellion was all what was needed to make his regime crumble. The rebellion was suppressed, but the price was the idea of establishing a strong royal power. If you think about strong monarchs in Visigothic Spain, they either used military expansion, such as Leovigild, or repression, as Chindaswinth, to strengthen the crown. Those efforts worked in the short term, but they are not sustainable in the long term. In the end, I think it was impossible to establish a powerful monarchy due to the very nature of the society and economy of the European kingdoms of the early Middle Ages. Too often, we look at individual kings as if their ability alone determined the outcome of a kingdom, but we overlook the circumstances that define their time. And with that, the verdict ends. In the next episode, I will end the period of Visigothic Spain, covering their history right before the start of the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. To end this episode, let me remind you that the podcast has a website, thehistoryofspain.com, where you can find the scripts of the episodes, a list of books about the history of Spain, and subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. Please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and more. Review the podcast, and follow the social media accounts of Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and thank you for listening.
Bye.